Hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone, for another incredible week of the Max Potential Habits podcast. This week, I am beyond thrilled to have on one of my all-time favorite authors. And I'm not kidding when I say this. This is a woman who has massively transformed my life through her work. Her main mentor, or one of her prominent mentors, is one that I have followed. She was the first book I read, which was Debbie Ford, and the book is The Dark Side of the Light Chasers. And if you've been following me for a long time, you've heard me talk about that book. I've also talked about Nancy Levin, who is our guest today. She is a best-selling author and a master coach. And I'm going to skip past all of the amazing things she's done because we're going to talk about it on the podcast. And her bio will be in the link in the show notes. You'll get to see everything there. We are going to have a really powerful conversation about boundaries. And all of you know that I've talked about my 3 pillars in building a successful life and business are personal power, women, relationships, and money mastery. Well, Nancy's book, Worthy, which if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. It's called Worthy. Boost Your Self-Worth to Grow Your Net Worth is one of the first money books I read that helped me go from food stamps to 6 figures in my business. So you're definitely going to want to read that. And beyond that, her boundary work, her relationship books are life-altering. She gives a ton of action steps in all of her books, and she's just, I can't wait for you to get to know her. The last thing I want to say before I introduce her, she's sitting right here smiling, and I can't wait to introduce her. I want to say I met her actually through a podcast, and you all know how much I love podcasting. That's why I have a podcast. I was listening to a podcast, and I heard her say this book. It's from one of her books. Honor the space between no longer and not yet. And to me, we are often in a transitional space. And that quote, I stopped the podcast, I wrote it down, and I meditated on it all day. And I was like, wow, that is very, very powerful. And that's what led me to reading all of her books, because I said, if that woman says that quote in that powerful way in this right moment, I know I need to read more and get to know her. And then I added her to my list of dream people to have on this podcast, and here she is today. So welcome to the show, Nancy.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm like gushing.
Good. You deserve it. You're amazing. And you're a boundary badass. So first, let's talk about your backstory. You know, for my listeners who don't know you yet, what brought you onto this journey of becoming a best-selling author in the world of boundaries, relationships, personal growth and development, all of those wonderful things that you help people with?
So this part of the story really originates with a blow-up, contentious divorce. So I was in an 18-year marriage and was really operating from the place of managing the perception of others, people-pleasing, bending over backwards, peacekeeping, not rocking the boat. And I didn't want anyone to see what was going on behind closed doors in my marriage. Mm-hmm. So I was in a marriage with a very abusive man who was a rager, and I, as a coping mechanism, stayed very quiet, stayed very silent, and yet at the same time that this is all happening in my marriage, I was the event director for Hay House Publishing. So for 12 years, I was the event director, touring the world with the greatest authors, thinkers, teachers in the field of self-empowerment, very close with Louise Hay, Debbie Ford, as you mentioned, Wayne Dyer, you name it. And I wasn't really able to let their teachings land in me until I was in my own rock bottom crisis. So the rock bottom crisis in my life came in the form of my being on the way home from an event with Hay House to essentially discover that my husband of 18 years had read my journals. And the long story short of that is that what he discovered in the journals was that I had had an affair 8 years prior. And this was really what I often say is, I set a bomb to detonate 8 years later, because I was in a place in my own life where I couldn't tell the truth to myself, let alone to anyone else. So that woman at the time, back in 2000, having an affair, didn't have the capacity to be able to say to the man she was married to, hey, I don't want to be here. So when we don't tell the truth to ourselves, the truth will come out, and it will come out sideways. So it will come out in illness or self-destruction, but it will come out. And so with the discovery of the affair being out in the open, my marriage essentially began imploding. And I spent 2 years post the discovery of my journals trying to keep the marriage together, doing everything I could, mostly because I was really fearing any sort of exposure. So he had threatened, I'm going to make copies of pages of your journal and share it with your friends, your family, your coworkers, and let's see what they think when they know the real Nancy. And the truth is, I didn't even want to know the real Nancy at that time. So I certainly didn't want anyone else to know. So this began my own personal journey of being able to really look at what had occurred in my own life. What were the patterns? What were the dots that started connecting? Being able to go with the support and help of my dear friend and mentor, the late Debbie Ford, going all the way back to childhood, being able to see the trajectory from being born into a family where my brother, who was older than I, had been very ill, and he died when I was 2 years old. And really the imprints of his death were the most significant of my life and painted the picture for me of what I ended up attracting, in terms of beliefs that became about, first of all, if I'm imperfect like he is, I will die. So thus begins the quest for perfectionism. My mother and I have had an adult conversation where she said to me, I didn't attach to you when you were born because I was waiting to see what was wrong with you. So this whole, another belief of there must be something wrong with me if I'm under this much scrutiny. Yeah. Better to be self-sufficient and independent and have no needs because his needs were greater than mine. Things like that. And then I really spent a good part of my young life trying to heal a grief in my parents that could never be healed. Yeah. And then the piece around, not enoughness. I now need to be more than just me. I need to take up the space of me and this lost child. I need to be more for my parents than just what I am. So all of this, gets right. All of this goes in the soup, and we all have some version of this. We all have some version of, a significant event in childhood that we couldn't process and digest in a healthy way. So we made it mean something about us. We started drawing conclusions about ourselves. This is where the shadow beliefs originate, because we are unable to process it in any other way. And then these are the beliefs that start driving the bus of our lives. Yeah. And because beliefs are magnetic, we will draw toward us what we believe. So, fast forward to even the day I met my now ex-husband, it was as if he said to me on day one, "Hi, I'm broken." And I said, "Well, great. I am Superwoman. I will fix you."
Perfect fit.
Right. Perfect fit. And that's what happened, so as we became more enmeshed, I was sublimating all of my needs to serve all of his. And that was the dynamic in our marriage and in our relationship. And because I didn't know a way to get out, I did the only thing I knew how to do at the time. So, I'm not here being this advocate for infidelity, but it's my truth. And it's what I did at that time. And it is actually what gave me the ability to set myself free. Ultimately, because I would have stayed in that marriage, I would still be there, bending over backwards, bleeding out, doing everything I could for everyone else and paying no attention to the degree to which I was abandoning myself. So the greatest thing was really discovering that the people I feared revealing myself to the most were the ones who rallied around me the fiercest.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the support of Debbie Ford, Louise Hay, Wayne Dyer, Reed Tracy, who's the president and CEO of Hay House, a very dear friend, my family, with the support of others, I started to then understand asking for help is not a weakness. Asking for help is really how I can learn to draw on the strength of others and the wisdom of others. And so I picture it like they built a scaffolding around me as I rebuilt myself. And so
beautiful.
Yeah.
There's so many things I want to say. I know you probably don't know my backstory. So I left my 15-year marriage, 17-year relationship through having an affair.
I do know because I cyber stalked you a bit.
Oh, perfect. And it's there, right? And that was my entry into this whole path. And so I see it as the greatest gift that there ever was. And, for me, I've gotten to have a really lovely recovery with my ex. Like, we're having dinner together tonight, and we have family dinners, and we're really close. And it actually brought us a lot closer. And it wasn't like that at first, of course, but the shame and the guilt and all of that stuff. And I love how you talk about, at the time you didn't have the skills to say this isn't working. And I didn't either. I didn't have the skills to say this marriage isn't working. I need to move on. And instead I did it the only way I knew how to blow it up. And it's, so I do a lot of shadow work, right? And I don't know if you know John DeMartini.
He's also a Hay House author.
Yeah. And I don't think he would ever call himself a shadow worker, but it really is what his method is. And so to me, there's a lot of alignment between Debbie Ford and his work. And it is the work that has set me free by seeing that shadow side and realizing that the closest people to you are going to embrace all parts of you, not just the ones where you put on the mask and look like you're perfect.
Exactly.
And you can go deeper when you actually are fully revealed to the best of your capabilities.
Yeah, because most of us go through our lives thinking the only way I'm going to be loved and accepted is if I hide this part of myself.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is that we're also going through our lives saying, I just want to be loved and accepted for the truth of who I am.
Totally.
And yet we're so conditioned to not reveal the truth. We're so conditioned to create the mask and the cape and the armor. Yeah.
And the love, to me, something that's been so incredible working with such a wide variety of people, all the way from I've worked with prisoners all the way to multi-millionaires. We all have the same stuff going on. All of us, and we think that we're the only ones, and I'm the only one hiding this really shameful thing. Could be a money belief. It could be a relationship issue. It could be your parenting style. It could be a substance addiction, all different kinds of things, but we're all going through it, and it all causes the same amount of shame that perpetuates that cycle. So it's been such profound work to, go through your books, Debbie Ford's, all of the great teachers to me that are balancing that out and helping you own your shadow parts. It's to me some of the most powerful work.
I would agree. I do.
Yes. Okay. So that's how you got onto this path. And it was that when you wrote your very first book? I know Jump came after that.
Yeah. So I filed for divorce in 2010. And then in 2011, I published my first book, which is a book of poetry called Writing for My Life.
Okay. Yeah, that's the only one I don't have yet. You need to get that one.
I'll send it to you.
Awesome. Thank you.
And that book even, so like the real transition out of my job as the event director at Hay House, which was my dream job. I thought I would die in that job. Never in a million years did I think I would ever leave. And then as I was going through my divorce, I wrote a poem that friends of mine at Hay House were getting married, and they asked me to write a poem to read during their ceremony. I have a master's in poetry, we should say. So they asked me to write this poem. And so the irony of here I am going through my divorce, and here I am writing and reading this poem during their wedding ceremony. And Reed Tracy, the president of Hay House, heard this poem. And he was like, oh, you're like a real poet. And I said, well, yes, I am. And he said, I want you to start sharing pieces of your poetry while you are emceeing the I Can Do It conferences. So back in the day, we did these big, several thousands of people conferences. And he said, as you're introducing the keynote speakers, I want you to also share parts of your poems. So this was this was radical to me because I have no problem being on stage. That was no issue.
Yeah.
Very different to introduce someone or, give the announcement about the lunch break than it is to sort of, bare my soul.
Yeah.
But and really also, this is where the process really began for me of being able to take center stage and own it. Really own my value in being there, my deservingness and my worth in being there, as opposed to being the one who's shown the light on everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was the beginning of that real transition for me to really be in the fullness of me. And so from that, he was like, why don't you, you should publish a book. Hay House isn't going to publish it. It's poetry. So I self-published my first book. I then began to do some speaking. So, Reed was like, program yourself into the conferences. And, the next thing I knew, I'm doing breakouts and keynotes and the whole thing, and doing sort of both at the same time, speaking and producing the events. And then when I was on the other side of my divorce with enough, bandwidth to process, Reed said to me, you should really write a real book now. And that's where Jump and Your Life Will Appear came. It's really the 10-step process of making a major change using my divorce as my through line. And then I self-published that book as well. And then shortly after it was self-published, Hay House picked it up, which was amazing.
So awesome.
And
they're on my dream list of publishers for the book I'm writing.
Yeah.
I want to say this to listeners because I think it's so important. Something that is the subtext of what you're saying is when you show up authentically with people who are pulling you up, they have the power to help you see in yourself what you aren't quite there and capable of seeing yet.
Yes. So I say this to
amazing.
Many of my coaching clients, right? Like, even if you don't believe, simply just believe that I believe.
Yes.
I can see and hold a vision for you that you may not be able to hold for yourself right now. And I do feel fortunate that I have had people in my life be able to hold that vision for me that I could not see at the time.